Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, folks. My name is Chris Ostrander, and I serve as the CEO of the Marine Technology Society. Along with MTS, these dialogues are being sponsored by the Global Ocean Observing System, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, industry partners Kongsberg Discovery and L3 Harris, and the U.S. Integrated Ocean Observing System. In this Dialogue with Industry series, we are focused on harmful algal blooms, and we welcome you and sincerely appreciate you joining this third and final discussion in the series. I'd like to start our discussion today with a quick overview of the ocean enterprise. Many of you, rightly so, may be asking the question, what is the ocean enterprise? And to answer that, we first need to look at the level of the ocean, or blue economy. The OECD defines the ocean economy as inclusive of traditional maritime industries like fishing, shipping, oil and gas, but also emerging ocean industries like offshore renewable energy, aquaculture, marine minerals, cruise tourism, marine biotechnology, and maritime monitoring and surveillance. This ocean economy is growing. OECD projects that it will reach $3 trillion by 2030, which is on par with the global commercial aviation industry. The ocean enterprise is nested as a component of this ocean economy within the realm of maritime monitoring, particularly as focused on the field of ocean observing, forecasting, and services. Spanning public, private, and academic sectors, members of the ocean enterprise are engaged with providing observation infrastructure, measurement, forecasting, and operational services to inform marine decision-making. Our Ocean Enterprise Initiative developed from the successful Dialogues with Industry series we held in 2022 and 23, and the subsequent development of the Dialogue with Industries roadmap. MTS received a grant from NOAA and IUS to build the Ocean Enterprise Initiative towards achieving the goals identified in this roadmap. And our mission is to grow the ocean observing system through better public-private partnerships by creating a globally inclusive forum to understand market opportunities, incentivize ocean solution innovation, facilitate data and information exchange, develop a workforce, and proliferate scalable technology to achieve benefits for all stakeholders of the ocean enterprise. The roadmap I mentioned a few moments ago lays out the three priority areas you see on the slide here, along with some of the types of activities under the initiative, such as the dialogues. To frame this initiative, I want to talk through an ocean information value chain. And this value chain is a framework to illustrate how ocean observations are converted through a wide range of interactions, transformations, and service delivery mechanisms into products that have value to decision makers and business leaders. Taking the value chain approach allows us to illustrate the importance of ocean information and related services. This graphic also visualizes the ocean enterprise and its interconnected components and activities across the value chain. The orange discs visualize the current level of private industry involvement in the segment, i.e. they offer an estimate of the relative market size. And the arrows indicate our estimate of private industry growth potential in each area. While this diagram is representative of the ocean enterprise writ large and not specific to HABs, we find it's a useful way to frame the discussions. Through these dialogues, we're hoping to better understand market aggregation and demand, opportunities to scale technologies that can foster innovation and move those quickly to market. We appreciate that participants we have represented today likely categorize themselves in multiple components along this value chain. We're looking for these dialogues to build upon each other, and so we do get to discuss all elements of this diagram as we move through. Our planning team has tried to craft these dialogues differently, and instead of a single panel or session at the many great ocean venues and projects, all of which are important, we've spent quite a bit of time curating 3 dialogues that will build on each other. We're looking forward to hearing from you on actionable recommendations, and our moderator will continue to push you in that direction throughout the course of today's discussion. It's now my pleasure to introduce our moderator for today's discussion, Hans van Summeren. Hans is a member of our MTS team and serves as the Senior Director of the Ocean Enterprise Initiative. Prior to joining the Ocean Enterprise Initiative, Hans was the Director of the Great Lakes Water Studies Institute at Northwestern Michigan College and spent 2 decades at the University of Michigan as a researcher, engineer, and administrator, spanning ocean engineering, marine technology, and hydrodynamics. Thank you, everybody, in advance for participating, and to Hans for moderating. We look forward to a robust conversation. Hans, over to you.
Great. Thanks, Chris. Thanks, everyone, for being here. Appreciate that nice introduction. It's my pleasure to conclude our 3-part series on harmful algal blooms with you today. And just going through a few of the housekeeping items for our invited participants, we ask that you please keep your video on during the discussion and use the raise hand feature so I can call on you to share your thoughts. I might target certain participants or groups with my questions, and to maintain momentum in our discussion, I may proceed to a new question before addressing all the hands that are raised. I apologize in advance to anyone I cut short or I may miss. I will also post the questions in the chat for reference for all attendees during the conversation. I encourage you to open the chat box on your screen so you can see the comments and questions that come in from our audience. Please incorporate your feedback into the submitted material. While you can't start your own chat thread, you can ask questions by raising your hand. And in the interest of time, I will not be introducing each of the invited participants. Instead, upon first speaking, please introduce yourself, include your name, your title, and your organization. And for our audience participants, please listen to the conversation and type your questions or thoughts in the chat box to everyone so they can see those. You can also layer in feedback to the questions or comments posted by everyone else. For everyone, please keep your microphones on mute when you are not speaking. Today's session will have 4 parts. Each of the first 3 sessions will include about 35 minutes of Q&A and discussion, separated by short breaks. I may adjust session length to match the conversation pace, and participants and observers can openly discuss matters in our 4th and concluding session. Please note that this dialogue and chat are all being recorded and will be made publicly available in the coming weeks. The content of the session report, however, will not include any attribution to the comments or questions of any participant. So let's get started. So while the first 2 conversations within this dialogue series focused on ways to increase private sector engagement, supporting sustained HAB data, observing networks, and downstream services, today's discussion will further dive into control strategies. In this first session today, we aim to capture a broader market perspective of strategies required for advancing the need of control methodology across the various HAB communities. Due to varying market demands for control across multiple sectors, geographic regions, organisms, or toxins, it is realized that a one-size-fits-all approach is not feasible, and the application of specific techniques and/or technologies all have merit and success. However, these approaches may suffer from a lack of coordinated understanding of the specific incentives or barriers that they may present. So I'd like to begin by asking the panel this first question, and that is, do we have a clear picture of the market demand and where that demand is coming from? Jessica.
Yes, Dr. Jessica Frost with Blue Green Water Technologies. I am the scientific director. I guess I'll be the brave guinea pig to start. From what our company has faced, market demand is asking for environmentally friendly products. There's a lot of reasons for that, but I'll just start there with environmentally friendly products and a longevity of a solution. One of the reasons, or one of the issues I guess we have faced, so you have different types of controls, right? You have a biological control, you have a chemical control, and then you have a mechanical control, which is often interchanged with physical. We are a chemical control company, but when you say chemical to the public, eyebrows raise, right? The caution sign goes up. And I think it's important to note that chemistry is all around us. We're made up of chemistry. Chemistry doesn't always mean bad, right? And so we do have a stigma, with being related to a chemical product and the narrative that chemistry means bad. So non-pesticide products are also another issue because of the way that regulation is set up. We're classified as a pesticide. And again, when you go into the terminology of pesticide, the public is, a little more weary, when pesticide terminology is used. But I do understand that, a lot of governmental, that being state or federal agencies are trying to safeguard their own policies, their own optics. So, a case in point, when environmental law groups decide to challenge you in your practice, right? So those are just some of the things that market demand, is leaning towards more environmentally friendly because of those particular issues. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Jessica. I'm going to shift to Nia, and then we'll go to Al, and then Kevin.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Nia Renee, environmental scientist with NOAA National Centers for Coastal Ocean Sciences, within the HAB monitoring and reference branch. So as the coordinator for the aquaculture branch of the National Phytoplankton Monitoring Network, I provided equipment and training to HAB monitoring and phytoplankton taxonomy to the shellfish industry. And so through communication with over 100 growers, I learned that the demand for control technologies spans beyond cells and toxin destruction. And there needs to address the unknown compounds that are making it through primary filtration, particularly at hatcheries, shellfish hatcheries, and causing deformation of oyster eggs, and those that cause reduced growth or mortality of juvenile oysters in grow out areas. And so when these events happen, sometimes the grower will see algal cells that may be the cause of these events, and sometimes they don't see any harmful algae, but the oysters are still impacted. And so in order to increase incentive for growers to invest in control technologies, it would need to impact their bottom line, and that's keeping the oysters alive and up to par with regulation, period. And so control technologies with an aggregated benefit to address algae, biotoxins, those that we know and those that we do not know of, viruses, bacteria, and dissolved oxygen are paramount, in addition to preventative technologies that balance the proportions of nutrients in the water, such as nitrogen and phosphorus. And these approaches, with aggregated benefits, are much higher in demand when compared to the targeted approach for one thing or the other. And so at both small and large scales, I would say that the demand is high for technologies that have this aggregated approach and aggregated benefit for the hatchery.
Great. Thank you, Nia. Al.
Al George, CEO of Greenwater Services, with Chaz Antonone, our COO and President of Operations. And what we see in the market is there are both private and public sectors of the market that can utilize these control methodologies, agriculture, water treatment in private, as well as, golf courses and recreational uses. Also in the public sector, the desire to remediate or mitigate HAB events is very paramount. And so we see a lot of that. So we believe that this controlling methodology has a wide-reaching effect in different organizations and industries and private sector, public as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Al. Kevin, and then Sean.
Great, thank you. Kevin Claridge, Vice President, Sponsored Research and Coastal Policy at Mote Marine Laboratory. Kind of on with a couple hats, assisting the state of Florida with the Florida Red Tide Mitigation Technology Development Initiative, specifically in Florida. And then partnership, and I see a lot of other partners on this panel that we've worked with on the initiative, but also the U.S. Harmful Algal Bloom Control Technology Incubator in partnership with Dr. Place here from Maryland and NOAA. The big thought for me, the easy, probably low hanging for southwest part of Florida is the tourism component, and the impacts of harmful algal blooms and developing tools and technologies to limit those impacts on the hotel, restaurant, tourism industry. So that's a very easy ask, and pressed on a regular basis to find solutions.
Thanks, Kevin.
Thanks, Sean Corson. I'm the director of the National Centers for Coastal Ocean Science. Work closely with Nia. Glad to be on the panel. Thank you. One of the things that I've been reflecting on, looking over the materials in advance of the meeting here about market demand, is that we have a pretty good understanding, or developing understanding, of the societal drivers impacts, whether it be, like we just heard about, impacts to tourism. We know there are studies about the economic multiplier impacts from red tide events along the Gulf Coast to the tourism industry, or drinking water impacts in the Great Lakes, or challenges with seafood, be those associated with aquaculture or subsistence harvest issues, that type of thing. But there does seem to be something of a disconnect between those drivers and a push for implementation. And maybe because I'm coming from a federal perspective, it seems to me that I tend to look towards the regulatory frameworks that are associated with any particular natural resource management issue. Most of the regulatory drivers right now, whether those are the HABARCA, the Harmful Algal Bloom Hypoxia Research and Control Act, Clean Water Drinking Act, Clean Water Act, or the don't necessarily have a system of penalties that's being enacted in a way that is commensurate with the societal impacts. And so it may not be, that limits the incentive to bring these things to large scale application. So just something to think about. There are regulatory drivers that are pushing us, that are certainly our guiding lights in working in this space. But in terms of getting local and county governments actively driven and engaged, they're oftentimes going to react to overwhelming economic incentive or to concern around regulatory constraints. And there seems to be a mismatch there.
Thanks, Sean. We're going to wrap up this first question with Dean, then Alexis, and then Heather. So go ahead, Dean.
Great, thanks. Nice to meet all of you and see all of you today. My name is Dean Trethuy. I'm the Managing Director for Aquafuture. I'm primarily in the aquaculture industry for finfish. I've been in this industry for about 30 years and trying to find solutions. I've done many projects, led many projects to help build mitigation systems, observation systems for the finfish industry. And I think there's still a lot of area for improvement there. And primarily, it's, first sets with the observation and the accuracy around observation. We are still, obviously, with open net farms in the ocean, you get what you get when it comes to the environment, and there's limited mitigations that you can do to, protect the farms for that. And each farm has the potential of at least $40 million losses in product because you're dealing with animals. Very challenging. And in my experience, we've tried so many different things over the years. There is success with mitigation. And remember, you're trying to basically bend the water quality in favor when you're in a bloom, which can be very difficult depending on the size of the bloom. And typically what we would see in areas where it's more prevalent, where we see blooms, the farmers themselves, because it's all physical observation every single day, They have to be well trained, understand the risk, about 13 different species of plankton they're watching for. And if they're in a high risk area, typically those areas actually do better than farms in lower risk areas, because the farmers there are, they're not, they're sort of can get caught sleeping. So typically the biggest losses we would see often come from human error and not operating the mitigation systems in time. So I think there's definitely room for improvement on early warning systems, and then even automated mitigation systems, and perhaps linking them too. I get nervous when we talk about both together because of the fail safes that are in automation, but I do think it's an interesting panel, and clearly there's a lot of room for improvement in the finfish industry still.
Thanks, Dean. Alexis.
Hey, yeah, I'm Alexis Fisher. I'm with Utrafix. And so we're a water quality restoration company, and we focus on large water bodies. So we're primarily working with municipalities, these cities, these counties that manage large water bodies over 100 acres or so. And water quality has gotten bad over a number of years, and they're looking to be able to restore the recreational function of this area. Or perhaps they're using this for drinking water. So those tend to be the main problems that we're focused on. And I 100% agree with what Jessica was saying with regard to, people want solutions that are eco-friendly. They want solutions that are going to last, and they want to be able to, have these solutions scale up. But another thing that hasn't really been discussed is, a lot of these solutions are really quite expensive for a large water body. And these municipalities, there's not money baked into those budgets to the water quality funds. Like, those funds don't exist. And so that's often why, they just kick the can down the road year after year, because they just don't have the money to actually restore their water bodies. And so that I would say is kind of a main a barrier for probably many of the industry partners here. The interest is, people want to have clean water, but yeah, the funding can be really difficult.
Thanks, Alexis. And Heather.
Hi, thank you. I'm Heather Raymond. I'm the Water Quality Initiative Director for the Ohio State University, kind of one of the academics on the panel. But prior to this, I worked for Ohio EPA for over 20 years. So I also have kind of that regulatory background as well. I'd say in response to kind of Sean's comment, that there is huge demand on our drinking water side and the freshwater for control, because we do, at least in Ohio, have regulations, and that did drive that. So I think there currently aren't any national drinking water regulations. There's just kind of guidelines. So I agree that can help increase demand, is if you have the regulations that require monitoring and treatment for cyanotoxins or other algal toxins, then that's going to increase demand. Also, our recreational areas, there are from the state of Ohio, at least public beaches, due to the advisory postings and the impacts on local tourism. And these smaller water bodies are easier to control than the ocean. So there is demand there. I agree, though, that kind of the regulations do help drive that demand. In terms of the response, I'd say, I know in the industry looking at improvements to control strategy, because I know I was working with some folks with Chile, and they were looking at automated bubble curtains, but it ultimately wasn't effective, and they still lost their harvest. And that's, again, $100 million losses. So how can we tweak those existing technologies? So yes, it's great to know something's coming, but in these smaller contained areas, you might be able to add ozone nanobubbles, like Chaz and other folks were talking, add an additional layer of treatment. So that's going to increase your efficacy. So I think there's definitely demand there, but there's really not a good option or very many good effective options out there that have been used at scale. And then finally, it's the who pays, right? I think there's a lot of demand, but you have limited budgets. And is this something that I was talking to folks that work in infrastructure, and one culvert will cost $500,000, but yet we can't spend that on protecting a beach or a recreational area. So kind of why are we not having that societal demand for these kind of pretty critical resources? And how can we change perceptions of that when we are spending a lot of money in other areas, but it just hasn't necessarily been a priority nationwide, at least in the US.
Right.
That's all I have.
Thanks. Thank you, Heather. All right, Isaac, I will let you wrap this one up. So thank you for raising your hand.
Oh, you're on
you.
mute.
Yeah, we're okay now, right?
Yes.
Okay, so I am Isaac Yuan. I'm from Institute of Oceanology, Chinese Academy of Sciences. Our team has just been involved in the field of HAB control for over 20 years, especially in the field applications by using a clay flocculation method. We call that modified clay. So I just categorize the demands of the HAB control into three parts. And for the first group, and the agriculture companies definitely the companies wish to have some kind of levels of HB control and to mitigate and the losses induced by the HABs to their culture. And for the second, I wish to highlight about the local authorities and the public. They want to have some control because, and there is a demand of them to mitigate the negative impact of HAB to the tourism or to the recreation areas. And for the third part, I wish to highlight that there are so strong demands from the coastal industrial companies. I mean, for the desalination plants or the nuclear plants, and this kind of companies or the plants try to use the water to be as the cooling water or something like that. But the HAB waters will just blocked and the filters and have some problem, not only to get some economic loss, but also to the safety. So they wish to have some kind of levels of issue control by themselves. So that is what I categorize from my field practices. Thank you.
Right. Thanks, Isaac. I'm going to build off how you left us and a few others also introduced it, and that is, how can we improve collaboration with affected industries and gain market insights that lead towards potential solutions? And maybe to even build that out a little further, how can farmers enhance their risk management strategies, leading towards better insurance coverage options and then furthering financial prosperity? So big question, but I will put that in the chat as well, but open that up to the panel. Dean.
Yeah, thanks. I think one of the areas then we've really tried to collaborate more is just the information sharing. A while back, I started a project just looking at it within the organization of finfish on the BC coast. It's incredible every day how much data is actually being collected, and for decades it gets lost. And we started an initiative where we actually digitalized that data and started using machine learning to see what we could derive from that data. And we went back and we had plankton samples all up and down the BC coast, including some of Oregon, for about 20 years. And we were working with a company in Santa Cruz, and they were just a startup company called Scoot Science at the time. And it was actually very educational because we have probes in every single farm, 5 of them going down. We have the stratification for temperature, oxygen, salinity. We're getting over 1 million data points a day, and we're able to start predicting 3 days in advance with 95% certainty what was going to change in the ocean, which is obviously three-dimensional area, which is difficult to do given different currents and tides. So there was a lot that could be done just with those 20 sites worth, but as you open up and look at this community, there's so much data and information being gathered all up and down the coast. And part of it is, and I remember somebody said years ago, we didn't have an oxygen problem until somebody bought a meter. And it's kind of true, because as soon as you start measuring, you start to learn and really realize the dynamic changes that's happening on the coast. And I don't even think we fully understand the change. And a big part of what we were learning is that it's not even so much of the change, it's the speed or rate of change that can have a damaging effect on aquaculture. In order to implement mitigation systems, they need to be done prior to the highest risk. Because if you try to implement them during the risk or when the bloom hits the fish, they're already dealing with a big stressor. And if you do and start to upwell water, you create another stressor. And then that actually became the lethality. So early warning and using that data, I think, as a community together to start even learning more about the changes of the seasons annually between springtime diatom blooms and fall migrating blooms, vertical migrators, I think we're still in the very early learning stages of it all.
Great. Thanks, Dean. Al. Oh, Al, you're on mute.
Yep. So let me unmute myself. So I'm Al Place. I'm the director of the HABs CTI. So one obvious reason is apply for the applications, $200,000 a year for all forms of it. I'm also going to cause real controversy right now. We don't believe in growing fish in the ocean. We have a very large USDA where we're raising salmon in downtown Baltimore. You don't have problems with HABs with recirculating aquaculture. You can do production levels equivalent to what's out in the ocean, and you're not putting food nutrients back into the ocean. The problems in Chile and Norway and so forth. Norway is a good example. That salmon kill was actually now due to a new harmful algae, never described before, and haptified, and actually produces a molecule very similar to the ones we described for carlotoxin that was responsible. So I think personally, for growing food, we should be doing it like we grow in factories and so forth. We can do it in the US. We can replace fish meal with plant protein. We don't need to harvest menhaden. In fact, you will never get a menhaden that's free of PCBs and methylmercury because of what we've done in the past. So I think in general, the idea of moving away from the current industries in some aspects, and I realize I'm going to get nailed from a lot of people out there. Now, in defense, we have not been able to grow oysters or bivalves in a recirculating system in an efficient way. It's still a problem that has to be resolved. But just keep that in mind. But again, I'm hoping the HAB CTI gets approved for further funding. We think it's a really straightforward initiative, simple proposal. We have a lot of very interesting technologies. I see two of our funded people on this panel right now that we may talk about their approaches. I'm done.
Okay. Thanks, Al. Barb.
Hi, I'm Barb Kirkpatrick. I'm with the Gulf of Mexico Coastal Ocean Observing System and a HAB scientist. I live in Sarasota, Florida, so sort of at ground zero for Florida red tides. And I'm actually sitting in Sanibel Island this morning because we're doing a human health study down here for Carenia brevis. Circling back to the tourism industry, I've worked with them for, I don't know, 20, 25 years. And I think one of the challenges for them, obviously it's a negative message for them. And negative messages we know is very hard for the tourism industry. I think the thing that frustrates them is not knowing exactly where the impacts are going to be. So again, more monitoring, more observations would help there. Also, it frustrates them at the not knowing of how long a bloom is going to last. So the question is, when do they, if we get them on board for any kind of control or mitigation strategy, we have to figure out where the insertion point is, or the treatment point, to help them mitigate their impacts. But while, it goes like crazy across the country now, oh, there's a red tide in Florida, I'm not going to go. So I think we need to help them identify where things are, if we can identify how long things might be. We've had this bloom going since October, but actually most of it sat offshore so far. So I think we just need to keep working with them and figuring out what they need from us.
Great. Thanks, Barb. Nia.
I think on the topic of improving the collaboration with affected industries, the participatory science approach has proven pretty helpful in getting farmers engaged with what's happening at their own site. So providing them with information on how they can observe their own water quality. And through this program, I've also been able to forge relationships between the growers and biotoxin researchers and HAB researchers. And so reaching out, providing information, and then creating those connections to our contacts has been quite helpful as well.
Right. Thank you. Any other thoughts? Heather.
Sure, and I'm not as familiar with the marine side, but I don't know if there's been any, type of survey work, because I know I was working with even Don about considering a proposed strategy for a marine system. But we're like, well, what are they willing to spend? Like how much does an impact, hit them? Like if they have, a Corinia or, an Alexandrian bloom, what is the economic hit to them? Or, is it just better for them to avoid, to not harvest during those time periods? So I think for the control folks, it might be helpful to kind of have a better understanding of, what are the impacts or what is the better mitigation strategy? Because in some cases, maybe that's just it. You just don't harvest. But I heard earlier from I think it was Nia, how she said, well, there's also impacts to the shell size and things like that. So maybe it would be more beneficial to have a mitigation strategy there, and you can't just close your beds for a period of time. So I don't know if that's something that Noah or others could assist with, is just doing kind of some survey work on what would you be, what are the economic hits to you? What are your preferred mechanisms? Is closing a bed sufficient, or are there other strategies? I know obviously with the finfish and the salmon, you're going to lose your crops. So in those cases, a mitigation strategy might be, more necessary. So just, I think, I don't know if that exists or if that has been done, but that could be helpful.
Thanks, Heather. Sean.
Just responding to Heather a little bit, there have been some studies that NOAA and others have been involved with to characterize the economic hit in the marine sector. One of the challenges that has often been cited is that, the events are dynamic, ephemeral, and hit different industries at different times around the country. So it kind of depends on scope and scale. And the hit to the tourism industry in some regards is very different than the hit to, say, the Dungeness, a domoic acid issue with Dungeness crabs, or with an aquaculture site or something like that. I think, though, you're hitting on a good point, is that we've got some good examples, in some of the background material. I think we've referenced the, recent $2.7 billion impact to the Gulf Coast tourism industry, and a little bit more specific data in the hundreds of millions relative to, say, rental properties or, VRBO, that type of thing. And some specific examples that we could pinpoint, in the Pacific Northwest due to losses in fishery revenue. As a community, it might be interesting to pick 4 or 5 areas to focus on, so whether that's, we can draw easily from, Great Lakes, Northwest Alaska, Massachusetts, Gulf Coast, and identify 1 or 2 studies, but it may be that we haven't gotten enough in aggregate in those areas to really generate a groundswell of enthusiasm for control technologies.
Thanks, Sean. Haru.
Hello, my name is Nobuharu Inawa from Japan, from Public Works Research Institute, National Research and Development Agency. well, in considering countermeasures for harmful algal blooms, I think it's important to separate the stage of HAB and what kind of countermeasure that you should be taking, like such as before bloom, early to mid, and peak to after. It's always think about the best approach in different stages. And in to explain something more detail is like before bloom, before the bloom period, it's involving more like creating an environment that's less likely to cause harmful algal blooms. Like regulations related to controlling water quality, environmental improvements at the aquaculture site and in surrounding areas, controlling and managing a microbiological community in the area, such as diatom, protozoan, bacterial viruses, and coastal vegetation, and seagrass and macroalgae. It's important to understand also cyst distribution and to removal of them. Measure to be taken there maybe early stage of HAB outbreak may involve like cage transfer and emergency herbs, right? And then the sediment lifting and spraying like bacterial viruses, and implementation of clay disposal and physical chemical method in the peak stage. So thinking about different countermeasure and optimizing a different countermeasure in the different stage of the bloom and stage. This helps actually to these idea to helps to think about how to cooperate with a different industry and to think about the optimized methods.
Great, thank you. And we'll wrap this question up with Dean.
Thanks. Yeah, and I was just going to add, looking at the different ways of mitigating, and if a site has systems on place, of course, they're very expensive to run. But they've obviously proven to be successful in those areas. But one of the things that I think the panel might be interested to see a change that, if you go back a few decades when those systems were being developed, it changed from obviously high mortality on those finfish sites to now having a system that could improve and had multiple years of success. But what most farmers around the world are all insured. And one of the changes that I saw with the insurance companies is that there was no benefit to a farmer if he implemented a mitigation system and could avoid it. So farmers in different regions around the world look at it this way. I've got insurance, so if I get hit, I'm covered, and maybe I'm only ever going to get hit once every decade. That is changing, and it seems that the prevalence of it is the risk is increased. So now insurance companies realize that farmers can put mitigation systems on and avoid it. The problem is there's no reduction in insurance because it's a blanket, and we're down to only a few underwriters that cover everybody. So we noticed when we started to prove a track record where we could avoid those losses, our insurance didn't go down because what they did is they blanket and said we're sort of covering everybody globally in this case. So I think there's a huge push for insurance companies to give incentive to companies to have better early warning mitigation systems and actually having the equipment on site, because it's millions of dollars to protect the farm, and you're also paying for the farmers that aren't doing anything.
Great, thanks, Dean. That's a good point. I'm going to lead off of that into this next question, and that is really the sharing of information or the ability to find information. And are there enough market landscape impact reports out there that are accessible for the commercial HAB community? And if not, what do we need to do? What's needed? Jessica.
I'll generally say no, they're not sufficient market reports. It does depend on the discipline, if you're going aquaculture, if you're going state monitoring. But I think the bigger question is choosing the appropriate metrics. Chlorophyll A is often used as a proxy for all algal biomass, right? That's usually a state standard, federally recognized as well. And so when we use that term in terms of mitigating, we, in my opinion, do not want to mitigate all phytoplankton groups, especially the ones that are beneficial, right? So when you talk about harmful, you're talking about your, red tide dinoflagellates, or in the freshwater environment, your microcystis or Raphidiopsis that create the toxins. That's what makes them, by definition, harmful. So I feel like metrics that are being used currently in some of these market reports are not necessarily reflective of the appropriate metrics. And maybe we need to look into pigments that are generated by different harmful algal groups. In the second question, if not specific reports needed, yeah, I think if there can be, oftentimes we're talking with our clients, about what are they collecting, and, they're not from a science background, science education background. They have a problem, they want an immediate solution. So we oftentimes have to ask them to create more work in order to get the kind of baseline data that we need in order to address the solution, because we've already stated this already in this meeting, that there's no one size fits all, and every water body is going to behave differently, has different conditions, has different operating conditions. So I think that, just trying to, if we can find a way to generalize an approach, standard operating procedure of the type of metrics that we as the experts want to see, that would help inform those markets, and they would know then what to look for.
Thanks, Jessica. Al, please.
Yeah, so I want to agree completely with Jessica. Chlorophyll A is not a good marker. We did NOAA funding. We treated a freshwater lake. Two methods: draining the lake and barley, basically, for 3 years. And then we basically, the subsequent 3 years, there was no change in the chlorophyll content because there was no change in the nutrients coming into the lake over that 6-year period. But there was a complete change from toxic microcystis to other algae, basically, with the same chlorophyll value. So pigments tell you so much about what's occurring in the process, and we have the technology in hand in multiple labs around the U.S. to do it.
Great, thanks, Al. Dean.
Yeah, just to add to that, I think it's so important that everybody in the plankton community has a portal that all the collected data could be added to. And I think, as Jessica's talking about, it's super important to make sure that that's accurate data. When we started doing that, even just within our smaller community here, it was a helpful tool, but we did realize there was a lot of errors in that data, and it was a lot of work to clean up that data first. And we tried looking at tools that could automate that. We looked at FlowCam, which is great. It takes a lot of specialization to, sort of teach it in the species that are local in the area, but it's not accurate. And of course, you still need someone physically to get the samples, because we can only see, blooms or surface blooms, what we can do and measure even from chlorophyll or satellite monitoring, but a lot of blooms are at 5 meters. You don't see anything from the surface. There's no coloration of the water. And some, like Chrysochromulina, it's down to 5 cells per milliliter is lethal to a salmon farm, and you won't ever see that. So those systems can detect it, but it's hard to quantify it. And I think, in 1 year, when we started hiring specialized staff that could look at the samples that were done on the farms, we did that blindly. One of the biggest mitigations you can do as a farmer is to not feed salmon before an event. For some reason, there's a relationship between salmon that are fed during toxic algae blooms and salmon that weren't fed. So one of the biggest mitigation strategies most companies have out there is don't feed your salmon. Well, that decision is made by the farmer in the field. And when we did a blind check on the sampling that was done, we found more often than not, they would make the decision to not feed salmon because they were too nervous to make the call based on their knowledge of understanding to identify the phytoplankton bloom. When we quantified that in 1 year, we lost more to potential growth of salmon than we had ever lost in 20 years worth of blooms. So it's difficult to put that reliance on people that don't have that background and training. And of course, in remote areas where the farms are, we don't have that specialized staff because they're more specialized in obviously growing salmon. So I think there could be work to look at the systems that can automate that, and then look at it putting that all into a portal that can create a much bigger community that can again help improve the data.
Great. Thanks, Dean. I'm gonna end the session with just two more hands raised. I'll go with Alexis first and then Don to wrap up our first session today.
Yeah, 100% agree with Dean with needing this publicly accessible portal with, high quality data that we can trust, it's user friendly, the public can access and say, okay, how's my water body doing? How's, being able to actually go to this reliable source, something like that would be really great. I agree 100% with Jessica where, you're interacting with a lot of customers who, oh, chlorophyll, hey, our chlorophyll levels haven't changed, but, if you're looking at the phytoplankton community composition, yeah, we've shifted the community away from cyanobacteria towards, kind of more beneficial algae like diatoms and green algae. But, I think kind of improving, the scientific literacy around that would be helpful. Needing to make sure phycocyanin is being sampled, cyanobacteria are being sampled, but then also really the toxins. And at least what I've noticed from just municipalities that I've worked with is toxin testing, sometimes it's done really regularly. And, when you interact with those cities, you're like, yes, you guys are on it. But there's so many times when it's done in a very reactive way, when it's, oh, we had a bloom, we got to get someone out there. A week later, they finally sample. And by then it's gone. Or they do sample and then they're getting, we get those results 2 weeks later sort of thing. So, I think there's a huge role here for, in situ sensors for all kinds of things for, nutrients, algae, toxins, to really be able to kind of build that, just that instant feedback of what's going on in the water and build that trust with the people that are being affected by these harmful algal blooms. And then that also gives us more ability to actually take action. Okay, there's a problem there, we can actually do something, but we are at that stage right now. The technologies are there, we just need to kind of get them in the water and improve how those data are processed in a quick, reliable way. So, I think it's a really exciting time, but we got lots of work to do.
Great, thanks, Alexis. And Don, I'll have you wrap this up.
Okay, I'm Don Anderson. I'm a scientist at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. I also head the U.S. National Office for Harmful Algal Blooms. But in this context, I also have a research program funded, in fact, by NOAA and by the CTI as well, looking at some control technologies. The issue we've been talking about a bit, reports and studies, a lot of people are referring to studies and monitoring to help decide whether and when a control or mitigation effort might be needed. I've got a lot of concern about the monitoring that is needed before, during, and after a control effort. We just had a workshop that Kevin Claridge hosted down at Moat, and a number of control technologies in the marine world were basically ready to go, and they've gotten the registrations, labels on their product, and I gather even some of them have already been contacting local communities and saying, hey, we're ready to go. What worries me as we all walk a very narrow line with the public and stakeholders as we talk about control technologies. I know Jessica is experiencing this directly, where she has a good approach, but has been stopped by basically an injunction or a lawsuit because of environmental concerns. And so what we need, what we don't need are efforts where people try to treat something and then it fails. and or that they treat a bloom and there's no real good information to let some of us who are unbiased evaluate it and say, yeah, it did work, or well, you didn't measure this. And so I think as a community, we need to put up some guardrails. Having some real visible failures is going to make it harder for all of us. So in terms of this question about what studies are needed, studies or reports, I think we truly need some real guidelines of what people need to do if they're actually attempting control on natural blooms.
Great. Thanks, Don. All right, I'm gonna wrap this first session right now, and I ask that everybody come back no later than 5 minutes from now, which is 30 after the hour. So see you in just a few minutes, and we'll get started with session 2. Thank you. Welcome back, everybody. We'll get started here with session 2, if everyone's back and on camera. Great. Well, thank you all so far for your excellent input and comments, and certainly the activity in the chat supporting this conversation is greatly appreciated, and some good comments in there. So as we move into the second session of today's discussion, which is more tightly focused on the overall landscape of control technology innovation, we will examine both the incentives and barriers affecting the growth and introduction of HAB technology into commercial markets. Furthermore, we will investigate assessment and evaluation approaches to expedite implementation possibilities. So with that, I would like to begin by asking the panel, what developmental and implementation shortcomings of HAB control technologies do industry partners identify, and what obstacles hinder commercialization? And I'll put that in the chat as well. Chris.
Yeah, hi, good morning. Chris Gobler, Stony Brook University, School of Marine and Atmospheric Sciences. And I've done a little bit of mitigation work, both on freshwater HABs, trying things like hydrogen peroxide and sonic approaches and photocatalytic approaches. And then in marine water bodies, I've been doing work through AL's HAB CTI on using seaweeds on shellfish farms in order to mitigate HABs. And that's just as way of background. But I think I'm sure I clicked on because I hadn't spoken yet, but this is an easy one, I think, in that I think I've seen in both freshwater marine systems, to me, I think permitting is the biggest thing. I'm in New York. The regulatory scheme here is super strict. I'm working on yet another freshwater innovation approach with a company called AECOM, where we're trying to put in an algae harvester on a lake. And if you want to do anything, you better get started, maybe 2 years in advance. But certainly nothing's happening unless you start putting in your plans a year in advance here in New York. And there's no, I get it. There's a limitation in personnel, and I very much appreciate that here in New York. The regulatory agency, the DEC, are very careful, right? They don't want to allow snake oil salesmen, and they don't want to allow for things that might harm the ecosystem. But the whole process is incredibly lengthy, and that doesn't even count for the idea of, I think people mentioned it before, I think maybe it was Jessica, like if you're considered a pesticide, well then you have to go through the whole EPA route. But there's definitely a balance. Obviously, like I said, we don't want to be harming ecosystems, and there could be bad actors out there. But streamlining would probably be helpful, because as again, I'm just an academic who's worked with different people, but I think I'm sure that the people in the industry will jump in and agree that it's really that's certainly permitting, both at the state and federal level, I'm sure is a pretty significant obstacle.
Right. Thanks, Chris. Al George.
Yeah, Al George, Green Water Services with Chaz Antonone. We have found the same thing. Permitting is the most difficult part of this operation, and it's because of a lack of understanding of what we do. And we look for opportunities to prove our technology. And, even doing that in many instances where it's been proven that, it's effective, we have a difficult time getting through government agencies to try to permit and, give the approval to move on to a bigger or more, effective employment of our technology. So I think that's the biggest problem with, the lack of understanding. And then, a lot of officials have the do no harm, do no more mentality, where they don't want to, take a chance on something that is not 100% bona fide proven. So that's been a big obstacle, but we're trying to punch through it.
Great.
Thank you.
Thanks, Al. We'll go with Jessica and then the other Al.
I'll save my permitting comment to the next question in our discussion topics, but there's basically a non-consensus among states and within state and between state and federal policies. What I mean by that is every state who governs their own water body has a different set of criteria that need to be met. And so even though we are an international company and we've done, applications within the US as well, state entities will not care necessarily what you've done and how successful you were in other places because it's not in their backyard, right? So they want to see that demonstration within their backyard. But to take that a bit further, we are a company that's been in practice for going on 11 years now. Last year was the very first time I had a state, and that being the state of North Carolina, require a toxicology test on the product, right? So it's a benefit. And I think there are a lot of innovations out there, a lot of solutions out there that may not have these toxicology tests performed because there's a whole gamut to that too. It opens a can of worms. Like, what do you apply the product on? What are you testing? What is your chronic value? What's your LD50 value? And there are standardized tests to do this, but what if your state doesn't recognize that test and wants it done on a different particular organism? And these tests are very expensive. They range about $16,000 to $20,000 each test. So you add up those organisms one by one, it does add up. But in retrospect, it's actually a benefit to the company or to the product, because it gives you that level of confidence that you can say to your next client, this is a safeguarded, product. We've done the testing. It's been recognized, third-party certified labs. But again, going back to my initial statement is that even within state, if you're dealing at county level, state level, local government, there's no consensus on what exactly they want, what's the roadmap to get to what they want. And then you have federal policies on top of that. You've got the Clean Water Act, you have NEPA, you have what I just learned, the Food and Drug Cosmetic Act. That was very new to me. Then you have FIFRA, which is the Rodenticide Act. And then you have when it comes to the toxins, that from these harmful algal blooms, you have the World Health Organization guidelines, right? And then you have EPA guidelines, and they don't always match up. So which one supersedes the other? So those are just some of the challenges in implementing the HAB control technologies that we have had experience with.
Great. Thanks, Jessica. We'll go next to Al, and then Heather, we'll have you wrap up this first question for the group.
So guys, on the chat, I put this, we're also developing a clearinghouse of methods, permits necessary and so forth. But we're also meeting at 3 o'clock today with the law offices to get a sense of what we're going to need for any of the particular methods that put in this clearinghouse, necessary permits and so forth. So that'll also be part of the clearinghouse website as we move forward. Don raised a really good point. What are going to be our metrics for success? Are we talking 90% cell reduction and 90% toxin reduction? That's success. It's something we're kind of dealing with the moat people right now. There are methods out there that do 90% of the cells and only 50% of the toxin. Is that a sufficient success in the process? So something else that we're kind of looking at is what will be a successful treatment option given metrics in the characterization. There may be times if it's just an algal biomass that you're trying to get rid of with no toxins, then just reducing the algal biomass is sufficient. So another thing that we're looking at is what are our metrics for success when we put any method on the clearinghouse, basically. And those who do risk assessment and everything else will help us to determine whether this is a viable approach or not.
Thanks, Al. And Heather.
Yes, I agree with Jessica at the Bears as someone who actually worked with a state in approving these types of strategies. One of the things that it's not really a problem, but the potential solution is, when we're working with industry partners and academia, we're evaluating a new strategy. I think there's two things is one is controlled replicated trials. So, going out and doing a treatment in a lake is not usually going to be helpful for a regulator because they're going to say, well, what would have happened if you didn't treat, or was this just a natural succession? So really looking at like mesocosm scale replicated trials that will stand up to the scientific rigor of this is not having an impact. The other thing that we usually do, and I'd recommend, is looking at the relative impact to existing approved strategies. So for testing a ozone nanobubble treatment, we will also compare that to a copper-based algicide and a hydrogen peroxide-based algicide to look at the relative impact of treatment. And then also our controls show the impact of no treatment. Because I think that's often not considered by these regulators. I think Chris Skobler mentioned, they think that no harm done is good, but if you don't do treatment, your biomass can go up exponentially, and that's also harming the ecosystem in many cases, or having downstream impacts. So I think just working with academia, you could look at what's the relative impact to existing strategies, what's an impact of a no treatment strategy, and then, really be able to base the new technology in context of existing approved strategies. So I think that data, I think, at least in my case, has been really useful to regulators to say, okay, yes, I may have harmed this one zooplankton genera, but overall, algicides had greater impact at those levels, and a no treatment control just decimated the zooplankton community as well. So, kind of giving them some things to think about. So just some recommendations there. Oh, and then one more thing, when you're dealing with newer innovative technologies, your monitoring may be biased because it was designed for a natural system. So just something to think about, like for us, when we were using a fluoroprobe, we were seeing after treatment, the fluoroprobe phycocyanin levels were extremely high. And then we realized that the oxidation effect on the photophores made them, even though they were dead or dying, it made it seem like you had higher concentrations of phycocyanin following either a hydrogen peroxide treatment or other types of oxidative treatments, but it was actually, so you had to look at different measures to show that. So again, your traditional measures may not be what you need if you're dealing with a kind of a new evolving innovative technology, and you have to kind of look to overcome that. That's all.
Thanks, Heather. I'm going to just move on to our next question. Alexis, maybe you'll be able to filter in comments with that. And really, this sort of blends a couple of the questions. Besides the US HAB Control Technologies Incubator, are there other global programs designed to accelerate HAB control technologies entry into the market? And Heather, you did touch on this in terms of test beds and realistic settings for testing products. Where are we with our test beds in terms of independent third parties available to evaluate these types of performances, and how much buy-in do we get from the users of those technologies based on the ability to test them in realistic environments? So yeah, I'm going to open that up to the panel now. So Alexis, I'll let you go first here.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Hans. Yeah, I'm just listening to Heather, and it was just making me really think about how, and also with these third-party testings, I definitely think I love this idea of a clearinghouse for, let's have a standardized way to actually evaluate these technologies, and let's make it outside of like a beaker scale with like clean fresh water. I mean, I think one of the challenges we've run into is, okay, let's look for the LC50 on like our product in this clean thing of water, and let's put some like shrimp in there. But of course, like that couldn't be farther from how the natural environment is. And of course, like when you have other things, you have the natural environment, you have all kinds of things in the water, and that's actually going to affect the binding of your product to things. And so like actually you'll have like a lower LC50 if you test your product in a natural environment versus in a clean water beaker. So, and I think that's one of the really tricky things, that when, different regulators or different municipalities look at those results, they're like, oh, well, your, LC50 was this. We need to actually have, and then maybe they don't choose one of your products because of that. But, when you're actually testing it in like the actual natural ecosystem, it's not having that effect. So it's creating a little bit of misinformation. And that's just definitely, a frustrating barrier that I think a lot of us have dealt with. So yeah, love that idea of, how big of a mesocosm do we need? Like, can this be done in like, by a third party? Because I think that would be like some standardized way, because that would really benefit, I think, everyone in this industry.
Thanks. Kevin.
Thank you. Yeah, I mentioned it just initially. It's in the state of Florida, we've had the Florida Red Tide Mitigation Technology Development Initiative, and I think Don or Al may mention over the last week we hosted the third workshop after almost 6 years of research across not only across the state, but to your question, I mean, really we tried to really attract on an international scale any tool or technology that was being used, and had conversations over the last 6 years really all over the globe of what's been used, and try to bring those ideas to Florida for consideration. Our testing, if you're not familiar, or your audience is, we do a very tiered testing, maybe going to where Alexis was going, from it's a tabletop or literature search to a tank, to a bigger tank, to a bigger tank, introducing representative for this marine Gulf species, off of Florida. And then that all the way through, considering, as we learned along the way, how important those regulations are, going to look your previous questions, before you would ever even consider going out into that field testing, which we have some actually out right now. We're working on and moving into field implementation as we speak. So it's a very tiered, methodical testing, bringing in all ideas from all over the world. The Red Tide Initiative in Florida is very synergized with the U.S. HAB Control Technology Incubator, sharing a lot of technologies across the marine and freshwater capacity as well. So just one example of an international scale.
Right. Thanks, Kevin. Haru, and then Sean.
Okay, I'm the only Japanese participant here, so I will bring up some Japanese project. Well, in Japan, there is a project promoted by fishery agency called Plan for Revitalization Coastal Fisheries, and then a member of the Japanese Fishery Cooperative Federation. So it's a national-wide organization composed of fishermen, and supporting actually the efficient practical implementation and dissemination of HAB control technology by taking lead role in verifying their effectiveness in natural marine environments in the area affected by HABs, with the support from the research institution. In this project, for instance, sediment lifting to bring up like diatom resting state cell to promote their germination have been carried out as early stage measures and evaluated in the Osaka Bay to suppress shellfish poisoning caused by Alexandra catenella. And when implementing control measure in natural environment, biosafety and local understanding and regulation have presented major obstacle. However, in the case of like biological many of biological way and sediment lift. With the case of this sediment lifting, it has been traditionally been conducted as a method for improving fishery ground and bottom sediment environment. So by applying it from the new perspective as a HAB countermeasure, these challenges have been overcome. In the context of that, the biological control method using like macroalgae and seagrass are also straightforward method.
Thank you. Sean?
Yeah, thank you. I guess I would say from a federal perspective, we certainly have challenges as well, trying to ramp up to larger scale field trials, whether we're talking about any one of the three primary kind of control technologies that NCOS has been collaborating with many of you on this call with to bring to scale. And one of the things that seems apparent is that when you're proposing to introduce anything to the environment and you put that in front of a permit reviewer right at the point of impact, when you ask an individual permit reviewer in their cube somewhere in the federal bureaucracy to review your permit application, their professional responsibility or their professional kind of reputation is on the line for looking at that in the context of other environmental regulations and standards that are out there. So kind of getting back to where Don was headed with having some kind of standards. And I think Heather maybe touched on this as well, that in some instances there are clear-cut standards, and whether they were talking about on toxicity levels or biomass levels, there can be regulatory drivers that say, this is something that is of societal importance, like we're recognizing that. And therefore, if you cross some kind of a threshold, there will be an impact. And that is an incentive in and of itself. It also provides a permit reviewer with something tangible to get a hold of, aside from, looking at speculating about lethal concentration levels or what have you in some sort of, mesocosm study. It's like at a certain point, if we've decided that we're going to set those kinds of standards and that's important, then it's incumbent upon the reviewers to find ways to get those things implemented.
Yeah, thanks, Sean. We'll go with Dean and then Don.
No, just thinking and looking at different experiments that have been done over the years, and I think it was I think it was Kevin that made a point earlier, just even about being able to have programs or look into different technologies that can help to identify and then predict. And I think it was comments even earlier about the tourism community. Sometimes it's just about knowing how long a red tide is going to last. And it reminded me of a project we were doing with the satellite monitoring. And we had spent about 3 years, doing daily sampling to calibrate what we were seeing with the spectrometer from the European Space Agency satellite. And it proved to be a very promising tool to monitor where blooms were. And then, of course, from where they originate to where the tides move them to. The problem we didn't continue to use that as a tool is because it was around that same time we ended up every single year we had forest fires. That would be so much smoke, it would block the visibility to the ocean. But when I think about areas like Florida, I mean, because we were ground truthing what we were seeing, we were able to isolate heterosigma so long as it was down to about 5,000 cells per mil. So what you can do is you can filter out all the other HABs, because typically chlorophyll, if it's just chlorophyll sensors, you're seeing everything, but we could isolate it to specific plankton species and then track and watch the movement of that. And then by using obviously different technologies in different areas where you can look at currents and modeling, you'd be able to predict how long those blooms would last and where they're going to travel to, just as another tool. But I can see different countries, different agencies all have sort of different things that they've tried. And if they failed in one area, that doesn't mean it wouldn't be successful in another one. And I guess there needs to be a way of being able to tie into that knowledge.
Mm-hmm. No, good point, Dean. Don.
I wanted to go talk about the issue of test beds. may make sense in the context of what Kevin was saying with mesocosm facilities down at Moat. They may, excuse me, even make sense in freshwater systems where you could have a common area that you could test a variety of approaches. But what we're finding in the marine world is that I mean, we all know it. HABs are very sporadic. They're in time and space. So how do you get the real situation that you want to test in a facility that might be fixed at one location? So I wanted to highlight that what's happened in Florida has been, I think, a really interesting evolution in that context, where in the very beginning, teams like mine spent a huge amount of time trying to locate it, not just one, but we ended up with 5 sites where we were approved by the state to do a treatment over, let's say, a half acre or an acre. But to do that, we had to contact every single abutter at every site and get letters approving what we were going to do. We had to deal with the state as well, and we had to find places where we could get power and access and so forth, and it was really a difficult thing. And what's happened though in time is that the state now, for several of these technologies that have advanced to the point where they actually have registrations, they have a statewide permit that allows them, instead of having, in my case, I had 5 sites hoping that a bloom would happen in one of those 5. Now, some of these technologies have the chance to go anywhere in the state to do a test. And there are some caveats around what they need to do right before they test. But that evolution, I think, is something that's needed far beyond Florida. I think it's a good surprisingly, I was surprised that the state was willing to do that, but now that it's there, I think it's a very good trend and one that will help this field move forward if it can happen elsewhere. But I don't see, that's very much the opposite of a single test bed.
Mhm. Great, thanks, Don. Cynthia.
Thank you. It took me a minute to get my speaker off. I had made a comment in the chat about the possibility of utilizing some of the testing methods that had been used for ballast water control. I mean, it was designed for detecting and determining the mitigation efficiency of harmful algae to begin with. And so, as we were discussing earlier, who would be this third party testing and how would that work? And so I was suggesting that would be a group to approach because a lot of them, there would certainly have the scale. They're talking about ballast water and that sort of thing. So they would have the scale where we're talking about mitigations for larger areas. And one of the questions in response to my comment was, how is this being used as well for invasive species? Because in addition to working on harmful algae, and I'm sorry, I forgot to introduce myself, Cynthia McKenzie, I work with Fisheries and Oceans Canada, and I'm the lead nationally for harmful algae and a member of the Intergovernmental Panel of harmful algae blooms representing Canada. And so when I'm not doing harmful algae, I'm also doing aquatic invasive species, which has got similar issues regarding detection and mitigation and response. And so, a lot of work has been done on the detection of harmful algae and other small organisms. And so, whether through ozone or whether through filtration and that sort of thing, so I was just pointing out that there is a group then that is pretty much designed to work on this sort of thing, and they should be approached. I think as a third party testing, they've pretty much already scaled up. I don't have any affiliation with any of them specifically, but I do know that there are many places that do this testing. So I was thinking that would be a place to start looking for these third party testing. So thank you.
Great. Thanks, Cynthia. I'm going to move on to the final question for this session. And We've talked about permitting. We've talked about some approval processes. We certainly talked about the value of test beds. What are some other considerations that we need to think about in terms of streamlining the process for rapidly deploying promising technologies and just that transition of new cutting edge technology into existing markets? Heather.
While everyone else is thinking, I'll go quick. I think for me, it's just what's the level playing field in terms of, I know others have mentioned that there's so much variability state to state. And I know that there's some work with HABs CTI to try and kind of come up with some ideas, but I think really just testing, like if you have a new technology, you should test it on these 4 model organisms, and this is what your approach should be, and kind of a standardization of the process as much as possible. And maybe it's getting all the states together to talk about this, like what is what is a problem in New York versus what is a problem in Ohio, or what's a concern. I know there's going to be variability. The species in Florida are going to be different than those in the Pacific Northwest, but at least getting some of the folks to agree on this is the approach we should use when evaluating a new technology, because I think that would go light years to help getting these regulatory concerns addressed.
Great. Thanks, Heather. We'll go Don, then Alexis, and then Jessica.
I'm going to take it a step further than Heather did, which is addressing the issue of how do you actually make a decision of when you're going to actually have a control effort, and is that just something that a company can make arrangements with a city, or again, I'm back into the Florida example, and this is an issue that came up at the end of the workshop we keep talking about. My own view is that unfortunately it adds more regulatory structure, but you need certain agencies like Fish and Wildlife and others to say, yes, you've got all your permits, you've got your registration, but let's make sure this is done right. And you also need that agency that's doing all the monitoring, let's say for the Florida red tide, to be able to say, well, yes, that is a Corynea bloom, that there is a danger that it might grow bigger or that it might move here or there. So I think we're on a whole unknown ground of how you decide when to treat something. And I think the way the workshop was driving was the need for a interagency group that already exists in Florida for them to deal with hurricanes and other disasters, led by their Division of Emergency Management. And they include people from Fish and Wildlife and so forth. And that group can help to decide how serious is this situation, especially if state money is going to be involved in the actual control. So beyond the process of trying to test the control methodologies and the appropriate facilities, I think there's a strong need for some oversight in helping to decide when and where these control efforts should be done, and that I hate to say more regulation there, but I do think some more oversight at the state level it makes sense.
All right. Thanks, Don. Alexis.
Yeah, well, I'm wearing my freshwater cyanobacteria hat because that's mostly what my company works on. So I'll comment on that. And I guess what we've noticed, so one of the main things we work on is phosphorus mitigation, and we use a lanthanum modified bentonite product to do that. And historically, alum that's been what's always been used, and that's been used for decades. And so typically when we talk to potential clients, like they know about alum, they don't know about what we use. Alum's got some pros and cons, but it is a known entity. And so people can be a little scared to try something new sometimes. And so I guess what I think would be helpful for, let's say our technologies, as well as a lot of others in the room here, is, I think we need some sort of way of just building knowledge around the public, kind of having, maybe it's some website where it's like, here's the possibilities of HAB control technologies. Here are the use cases when, hey, you might want to use this for Karenia. Hey, you might want to use this for, small lakes for cyanobacteria, or big lakes with cyanobacteria, but just kind of like some sort of trusted resource that's clearly a third party entity that some small city could say, hey, we got a problem. Like, what are we supposed to do? They could go there, have their list of possibilities, and not just be, there's so much out there on the internet. And I think like something like that, and maybe that's tied towards, some of this test bed stuff we're talking about. But, I think some sort of resource that kind of actually publicizes some of these new promising technologies that maybe came out of the HAB CTI, that would, I think, lead to more rapid use of those. I think we just need to kind of build awareness by, trusted third-party sources. So.
Great, thank you. So we're gonna go with Jessica, and then we'll end this session with Dean.
I don't want to be the contrarian, Hans, but I'm going to challenge one phrase in that question, and that is fast track. Because I think most of the people here on this panel have experienced that nothing is ever fast tracked. Even if you had unlimited amount of resources, you're still at the mercy of a lot of people and decisions. So, with that being said, I will say that I was part of a question sort of panel from graduate students at the University of Maryland. I think this was a spinoff from HAB CTI under Al's group and Taylor Armstrong, where they have a capstone project on creating a roadmap decision tree, if you will. So they're speaking with scientists, researchers from academia, commercial people like myself and our company, to learn from their experiences. Where are the pitfalls, or step 1 to step 2, where do you go? And it's a decision tree. If you have a yes, no, you go this way. If you have a, so on and so forth. Everybody knows what decision tree is, but one of the things I didn't mention during this conversation about barriers and why I say it's not a fast track is because dealing with permitting, at least, for Chapter 40 CFR, there's no surface water regulation permitting. It's all under wastewater. So NPDES, the pollution elimination discharge system. So it's like fitting a square peg into a round hole, in biology and in some of these surface water areas, they don't, the issues are not always consistent with what's happening in wastewater, if that makes any sense. So we need to somehow establish some type of surface water permitting pathway rather than following in line with NPDES. And then one of the other reasons why fast track is also kind of, a misnomer is we haven't talked about OSHA, the demands of OSHA when you're dealing with a product, when you've gotten to commercialization, the shelf life, hazardous transport, all of those have a $sign attached to that. So finding those, meeting those criteria and finding, those who can transport your materials is also a part of the logistics involved in getting your promising technology to a mature market. But that's my take on that.
Great. Thanks, Jessica. And Dean.
Just to add, I think one of the other roles, I'm a board advisor for COAST, which is Center of Ocean Applied Sustainable Technologies. And I think one of the challenges, and you see this in innovation for all aquaculture and even energy, ocean, anything that happens in the bodies of water in Canada is controlled under the Department of Fisheries and Oceans. And a lot has to do around the Fisheries Act. It's so outdated. It hasn't been updated since the 1900s. And when you look at really good ideas, great companies starting to have a great initiative, there's so much red tape that they almost starve to death before they even get out of the door. And I think there needs to be a mechanism in there that allows the testing and of an innovative ideas to be done outside of the normal regulatory framework. And if you're looking whether it's on land or in the ocean, you get into forest and land that has overlay, and that gets even more complicated. And so you can be in red tape for 3 to 5 years before you can even test a prototype. A lot of times industries will partner with innovative companies and carry that load. But even in aquaculture, unfortunately, so much of that testing has to be done on full production sites. So it's a high risk to innovative testing. And there's no places that exist to do a smaller scale and work on a lower risk before you find out how well it worked or didn't work. So I think the regulatory system needs to be modernized to really facilitate a lot of the innovative companies that are out there today.
Mhm. Great, thanks, Dean. And we're going to probably touch on that a little bit with the next session. Right now, I'd like to take a short break, even shorter than last time. It's 10 after the hour now. If we could just do a quick 3-minute break, and then we'll get started on our final structured session. All right, welcome back, everybody. Well, it's been a great discussion so far, and I very much appreciate everyone's thoughts and input to the discussion. So as we begin our last structured session, which focuses on public-private partnerships and implementation strategies, just leading into this discussion, looking at growing HAB control solution demand necessitates open dialogue. And that dialogue bridging public and private viewpoints on strategy scalability and value realization, things that I think many of you have touched on already. Collaboration and connectivity between key stakeholders will not only expedite market solutions, it will also provide scalability in control efforts. So I'd like to begin this session by asking this first question to the panel. And again, this is going to touch on some things that maybe you've already hit on a little bit, but the role of policy and regulation. Can exceptions be identified and applied in the case of certain HAB control methods? Jessica.
I don't have an answer, but I will at least make the statement that it would be nice or beneficial to have one act for surface water, because I mentioned already before, and other panelists have mentioned the FIPRA, the Clean Water Act, NEPA, and the FDCA, the Food, Drug, Cosmetic Act. It'd be nice if we just had an act set alone specifically for surface water.
Great. Thank you. Thanks for kicking it off. Kevin.
Oh, Kevin, I think you're muted.
Thank you, Casey. Appreciate that. No, say definitely a difficult question that we take very seriously. We've been taking very methodical steps all the way along, as I mentioned before, very measured steps in the lab before ever considering taking anything out into the field. Making sure we check all the boxes from the federal and state regulatory side. Some of the things we're doing in Florida, there's maybe 8 different agencies that have to weigh in on something before going back to some of the previous conversations. But I think there are areas you could look at, say, again, thinking of marine for down in Southwest Florida, a dead-end canal, and working in that area rather than taking that product immediately offshore, just, maybe a little bit of common sense things of where you can work in a very structured, measured, contained area to start introducing some field variables. And then especially if you have an active bloom or active HAB to work on, that may be the only stretch of the normal regs, I would recommend from the stuff we've been doing with the Red Tide Initiative.
Okay. Thanks, Kevin. Al.
You guys can hear me. So, Jessica, I'm a little worried about only surface water. Gambardiscus is the largest intoxication worldwide for humans. And if you include only surface water, you're forgetting ciguatera and metatoxin intoxication that occurs. So, I mean, I realize what your move is, but we have to make sure that you're not immediately going to have to not deal with the benthic environment, especially now where we're finding more and more in freshwater where antitoxin is a big issue in the cyanos.
Okay. Thanks, Al. Any other thoughts? Al George.
Policy and regulations are very important, obviously, because that they dictate what we can and cannot do. And it all depends really on the public official or the governmental agency that is reviewing the work. And do they have a do no harm mentality and they don't want to do anything, or or they want to be more proactive and believe that action is better than not doing anything. And so I think a lot of it comes down to policy and regulation, but also comes down to the regulator or the public official who's reviewing this work and what is their incentive? What is their incentive to get this problem solved? And so that's what we bump into. So a lot of times, you have people with different ideas and different, motivations, but the policies and the procedures do, set the foundation of where we can go and how we can get there.
Great. Thanks, Al. And Dean.
I think, and this isn't any kind of a solution, but it's an observation that in the complexity, when I look at the regulation in Canada on the BC coast here, and some of the things I find looking at the imbalance of how certain industries can operate versus others. And an example, we had treatment or water treatment facilities done on processing plants, what they were releasing back to the ocean. And there's a completely different policy for what happens with aquaculture versus what happens with wild fish. There's no regulation on them. And when you look at even waste treatment facilities, which is such a huge driver of plankton blooms in and around the BC coast all the way down to Oregon, it's like the industry for waste processing for what gets put back into the ocean, even to the point where it's literally, we look at E. coli. And so You know, I saw a report not that long ago that showed 90% of the plastics in the ocean actually come from these treatment facilities. So they're able to operate without this type of parameter, where industry is held to such a high standard, it's almost impossible to create the innovation and the tools to meet that perception. And what I mean by that is that when government officials have to sign off on all those applications, they're usually doing it with what they think is the public perception of how that's going to be. So they don't go forward and they don't approve it, which creates it very difficult for any new innovation to come into place, even though the existing impact in the ocean today is at a low standard and needs to be brought up through the government themselves. But is a real dichotomy of the two regulatory oversights.
Great, thanks, Dean. I'm going to move on to next question in this session, and that is really looking at the roles of tourism boards, economic development organizations, other similar groups. What can they do, and what role can they play in speeding up the testing and implementation of control mechanisms? Jessica.
I just wanted to help facilitate the conversation. So I think putting control or ownership into their hands. I think Heather mentioned as well that, or maybe Alexis, that a lot of these local government, if you will, DOH or county governments don't have line item budget for, you know, such type of activities. So empowering them with funding for those kinds of activities puts the onus on them and their ownership and control. And I don't want to pick on any, you know, RFPs that are out there, but I know with the state of Florida, there was an RFP for like green infrastructure, right? You know, building a sustainable, using sustainable materials for building, right? And this in turn would help the economy and you know, at any rate, what I'm trying to get at is trying to change the narrative from, you know, if we build it, they will come, to if we manage it, they will come. So what good is having the funding for green infrastructure if you don't manage a problem and nobody comes to use that infrastructure? That's just an example, but you know, it's again kind of tying in a lot of the comments that are made here that, you know, everything requires funding support, but you know, trying to allocate it more appropriately. And then I think there's a few other panelists here that mentioned remote sensing, monitoring, you know, those kinds of alerts. I think that's really key. The tools are out there. There's a lot of redundancy. There's a lot of, you know, groups that have created, you know, remote sensing monitoring. Our company has even created it, right? But I think it's teaching the public or teaching these entities like tourism or DOH of how to use the tool and knowing when to treat. I think Barb mentioned this as well. It's critical to know when to treat, and you know, remote sensing can only go so far because you're only looking at the 2D surface, right? But then you have some boots on the ground routine water quality monitoring that you can leverage, you know, when you're looking at a 3D space. So knowing when to treat algae, you know, 101, you know, everything has a growth curve. You know, you have a lag phase, then you have an exponential phase, and you have a stationary phase, and then you have senescence, right? That pretty much every phytoplankton group is going to fall under that growth curve. It may be short, it may be long, may be high, may be low, whatever the case may be, it's still going to follow that pattern. So if you have those kinds of remote sensing tools leveraged with your routine water quality monitoring, you know, hit that curve just before it enters, or just as it's entering in the exponential phase. That's when you really know when to treat and not be reactive at the peak phase, you know, and where it becomes visible in an eyesore, and that's a very reactive response. Let's be a little bit more proactive in our managing approach. That's my contribution to that question.
Great, thanks, Jessica. Al, and then Kevin, and then Alexis.
So what we've experienced is that, if you're a community organization such as like the Chamber of Commerce or the Tourism Board or a professional organization, even a Marine Club or a group of people who are using a facility or body of water for recreation. These are public organizations and people that are, volunteering and so on. Now, what they can do on the front end is put pressure on public officials. Look, we need this taken care of. It's hurting my business. It's hurting my restaurant. It's hurting my marina. It's hurting my aqua culture business. So these are the things that they can do. They put pressure on the public officials who are in decision-making positions and, make them be more proactive. Talk to us. Talk to people who have ideas that can make things better for them. And, put the pressure on them. They're elected. One way or another, they need to get elected again. So, making things happen, making things go better for their citizens is very important. And these organizations do have input in that. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Al. Kevin.
Yeah, thanks. First, just a quick comment. I really have to say thanks to a lot of the support that I've seen for the marine side testing, specifically for red tide at the local, state, and NOAA federal level has been great. I mean, so a lot of applause immediately. A lot of interaction with municipalities and counties to socialize and get the word out there. So anytime there's a progress being made or events or workshops or I have to say a lot of thanks. Specifically for TDCs, tourist development sides of house within local governments. Again, probably the same thing. They could be maybe not always have the funding to move, but could sure help us socialize what's going on. As the science progresses, getting it into the HOA meetings, getting it into their social media announcements, getting it into any advertisements of what's going on locally. So to not hinder a perception of the what tourist sides of things locally is where I'm going, I guess, to say that it's not there are options out there, and to not to know of them. I guess I'm dancing this closely to make sure that we're not getting that word out there and very measured, and the right messaging is very important, and the TDCs can serve that role.
Great. Thanks, Kevin. Alexis and then Heather.
Yeah, I mean, well, stakeholder consensus, building that consensus across, municipalities, tourism boards, small business owners, that can be one of the hardest things with, just deciding to make a change and, let's try to control this harmful algal bloom that, maybe is having economic impacts on the community. We found that, economic, like if HABs are hindering economic development, hey, we have declining tourism revenues to some area, that's a big catalyst for action. We also find that, if there's someone's dog dies because of a harmful algal bloom, that's another thing. And those, having a stakeholder consensus can really be a make or break a thing to actually, allow HAB treatment to occur. So I mean, I think that these tourism boards, economic development organizations play a major role. And, the more that, like Kevin was saying, the more these groups understand the solutions out there, and that can feel empowered that oh, we could actually do something, and this could, we can make a change and actually bring in more money, then they're more likely to actually do something. I think about, we have one case for a lake up in the Pacific Northwest that we treated where, it was total toxic cesspool, so much nutrient pollution, but it wasn't until a police dog got sick that a mayor actually made it part of their re-election campaign to clean up this lake. So it's those sorts of kind of local events that, that public perception of these things can, be huge factors in deciding to actually treat a lake, for example.
No, good point. Heather.
Oh, I don't know how to start. But I'd say increase or really seeing if you can engage these industry groups, tourism boards, local chambers, to advocate at the state and federal level for these changes, because a lot of times, you know, municipalities want to make a change, but their budgets might not be there to address a big problem, especially if they're on like a Finger Lake or something like that. Because I will say that like the state of New York, state of Ohio, state of Florida, they've all made HABs a priority, and it's brought a lot of more money, resources, interest, accessibility to address the problem. But that's just 3 of our 50 states. So how can we, you know, and looking at HABARCA, even, you know, I was advocating for, you know, reauthorization of HABARCA and trying to find municipalities that have had dog deaths and problems and impacts to their lakes. In Texas, they weren't even able to, because they're a municipality, they weren't able to provide an official letter of support, you know, for HABARCA because of just, you know, some of the restrictions that are placed on municipalities for things that might be considered lobbying or might be considered, you know, just think, you know, the vagaries of working in government. So where industry and tourism boards and local chambers and nonprofits can kind of fill that gap to really send that message, to share that message from municipalities and those impacts. That's something I hadn't thought of before, but could hold sway in where the money and the federal funding and state funding goes, because politicians listen to these things, and it's just trying to make sure that message is heard. And so however we can elevate that would be useful. And maybe it's looking through those organizations. And if they got that message from multiple areas, multiple states, multiple coastlines, you know, it might start to hit home.
All right. Thanks, Heather. We'll go with Sean and then Haru.
Thanks. I think we are at a pretty good place where we've seen examples of you know, individual users or user groups reaching out and advocating for support, and we know that can be effective, but it may have you know, kind of run its course. We may be at a point where it's gone as far as it can go to tip into a next level of implementation on this. I really like the idea of, and my staff who are on this call will be rolling their eyes about this, but I love the idea of kind of regional pilots that can be tied to real world issues. So something that a number of folks have brought up, I think Florida was used as a context by, you know, engaging, you know, the secretaries of natural resources or the kind of key levers in those conversations at places where there is an economic impact that is tangible and we have enough data on. So whether it's tourism there or drinking water and freshwater bodies or what have you, you know, picking 4, 5, 6 areas to really highlight, not losing sight of the fact that this is a national and international problem, but using those as kind of a driver to initiate action could be helpful. And just one last point on the issue that was raised about the kind of point source discharge challenges in Canada. You know, tertiary nutrient treatment for phosphorus and nitrogen, for example, was not pushed down to point source places like water treatment plants until there was a regulatory hammer to make that happen, because it's expensive, you know, and so local municipalities do not have discretionary money at all. They hardly have any money to deal with at all anyway. So even if they've got a regulatory hammer pushing on them, they oftentimes have to decide among which of those regulatory hammers they're going to be most responsive to. And so really trying to push standards and implementations of standards and technology at a point source through a governmental lens will, I think, require a pretty strong incentive.
Thanks, Sean. Haru and then Barb, and then we'll wrap up this session and go to our open forum. Oh, Haru, your mic, it looks like it's on. We're just not able to hear you, though. Not yet. There you go.
Can you?
Yes. Yep, good.
In the context of speeding up and testing implementation, it's, well, as you guys discussed, it's critical to foster understanding and providing education on harmful algal bloom control among various stakeholders from different backgrounds. But at the same time, I think it's important that a proposed HAB control measure is multiple beneficial prospective appeal to multiple stakeholders, like including fishermen's, government agency, and tourism industry, and the environmental organization, local community, and so creating strong momentum for these initiatives. For example, the crystal gobbler previously mentioned using a control method that using seaweed, which offer a broad range of benefit, like improving fishing grounds and conservation the environment. Because marine HAB is often a phenomenon characterized by the uncertainty, including the timing and scale of occurrence, as well as the extent of economic damages. Consequently, the need for HAB mitigation in any given region can vary greatly depending on when and where the risk of the HAB outbreaks. So therefore, effectively promote HAB control technology, not only just reducing uncertainty by collecting data and improving predictive technology along with advancing control method, but also explore way to provide additional values. Doing so help generate more stable demand.
Thanks, everyone. And Barb, you are the final thoughts on session number 3.
Wow. And I'm not going to simplify it because nothing is simple in the HAB world, right? I'm actually going to complicate it a little more, which is a point of when to engage people. And I'm a firm believer that it's not when you're getting to open water or even a mesocosm stage, because they won't have an understanding of the amount of effort and the amount of science that has gone on to get to that mesocosm or open water demonstration. And so it's unfortunate. It's more work for we, the science community, to engage them very early on when you don't really know if this is going to be a viable mitigation strategy or not. But I think if you wait until you're to that mesocosm open water, it's going to be a harder sell than if they understand the amount of effort and the amount of science that has gone on to get to that level.
Mm-hmm. No, thanks, Barb. And thanks everybody for putting together a great final session here. I'm going to propose that we do not have a break now and that we open this up to our general attendees who have been listening patiently. And just to give you some context, this last piece of the discussion will be open to any and all through the raise hand function. You can share a thought you have, uncover a new thread, raise points. Nothing's meant to be out of scope for what we're going to talk about now, and really looking towards how can we leverage your information towards making focused recommendations in our reporting. So given that, I am still going to put out a prompt in the discussion chat just to keep some people thinking about some ways to contribute in, and that is, what are your discrete recommendations to reduce cultural barriers to implementing controls, better validate control methodologies used, and how to foster cross-sector engagement with tourism boards, water collectives, shipping, and desalination companies? So I'll put that in the chat. We'll help those who are in the attendees list unmute and be ready to answer or ask your question or create the dialogue. And I know we've got one attendee, Ed Holden, who's been very patient with his hand up for quite some time. So Ed, we're going to turn it over to you to open this session.
Yeah, thank you. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes.
My name's Ed Holden, retired engineer. I'm on the board of directors for the International Society of Automation Tampa section, professional engineer in Florida, and many years in the nuclear industry as far as a background. We're not splitting atoms here, so I can definitely feel your pain on regulations. First thing we need is a point of distribution here in Southwest Florida. I live on Sanibel. To put some focus in, there's somebody here from Sanibel. We're getting ready to cancel the STEM boating cruise tomorrow afternoon because of red tide. If you want to find red tide, it's here right now. If you want to have a point of distribution, I think Sanibel's the right place here. If Jessica can send me about 5 carboys of that secret sauce she talked about a couple of weeks ago, we'll take them over to the mosquito control, Lee County mosquito control place, put them on the helicopters and have it on the water maybe tomorrow afternoon. If you need to stage something in my driveway, there's a freshwater pond right here on the golf course I'm sitting on. So this is a place for taking this thing out to the water. Second thing is International Society of Automation is having their international instrument control systems in Orlando this fall. If anybody wants to come down and talk best available control technology, I'll come up to Orlando, and you can probably take your pick of people that have sensors. And Liz and Kevin had us over 2 years ago at one of their meetings. I presented a little bit on what the controls engineers can do for this thing. Anyway, that's pretty much it for me. And Kevin knows how to get a hold of me, and I will work through remote on anything I'm asked to do. So Kevin, if you don't mind, hopefully people will talk to you, and if I can help out, I'm here.
Great. Thanks, Ed. While we're looking perhaps for some more hands to come up, I'm going to pull a question for everyone from the chat, and looking at integrated pest management as it's used in terrestrial agriculture. Has this been considered for HABs? It is, for example, being used successfully to control crown of thorns starfish on the Great Barrier Reef in Australia. So any thoughts on this being a technology or a use methodology that could be incorporated? Peter. Casey, are you able to unmute Peter Moeller?
Yeah, working to ask to unmute right now.
All right.
Peter, you may see a pop-up on your screen that will ask you to unmute your microphone. There you go. Peter, I'll just say if you are speaking, we can't hear you. But I do see that your mic is unmuted now.
Okay, Peter, I've got your note in the chat, and I can start with that. We should also be considering stronger engagement with the USDA, FDA, DOD, etc. All have active, clean, safe water initiatives, but the focus is too small. So we need a concerted effort for water cleanup. All right. Any other comments, thoughts, questions for the group? I can't believe we've covered everything, but perhaps we did. Oh, Greg, please.
Can you hear me now?
We can, yes.
All right, perfect. Yeah, so I just wanted to pick up on the aggregation of demand thread, and this has been touched on by a couple of folks, but there was, sort of mention of the desalination sector, ballast water treatment and management, et cetera. And I'm just curious, this is really more to the industry folks. I haven't really heard a lot of targeted engagement with those various sectors. And I'm just kind of curious if that is an area that is being pursued in addition to some of the, the targets that have already come up in the discussion this morning.
Don.
Oh, Don, I think you're muted.
To address at least the sector, the desalination side of things, I can speak to it from two perspectives. I am editor of a big book about HABs and desalination that we put together some years ago, freely available for download from the IOC, but it's a big, heavy-duty book with lots of practical things for desalination plants and others. There's even a control chapter in there. But we've produced that for that industry, and I guess afterwards expected a reasonable amount of follow-up with people wanting to take advantage of some of the new technologies for monitoring, inline instruments to look at what might be coming into their plants. I'm also the chair of an intergovernmental panel task team on desalination, but the truth is we're getting very little interest from the industry. They've got their technologies with filters up front, sand filters. They've got flocculation processes with adding iron and other things and removing blooms and so forth. And we haven't really been able to get them to be that interested in controlling what comes into their plants with any of the technologies that we're talking about here. I think Isaac may have a slightly different story in China. I don't know, but thus far, other than perhaps putting some instruments in line as part of research studies at a desalination plant, I really haven't heard of anything where that industry or that sector has come to us for help.
Thanks, Don. Isaac.
Yeah, I have a following message regarding Don's talk, and Don is talking about desalination talk, but we have the scenarios of HEP control in China in the nuclear plant, along the coast, because there are two stories. The first story is the HABs would block the water inlet, the cooling water inlet into the nuclear power plant. So there is no other choices except for the clay flocculation or other HAB control approaches and to deal with this problem. We have filters, but the cells of the HAB is too small. So that the filters could not work efficiently. So we have to use some alternative or promising approaches to deal with these problems. In China, we use the clay flocculation here. And the other thing I wish to share for this, the cooling water inlets or the nuclear plants scenarios, we do not it is not necessary to treat or to remove all of the cells to the bottom, and we just to control the HAB cell density into a level which would not block the cooling water into the power plant. So we could do some very flexible implementation plan by using some promising approaches. So that I'm done. That is what I wish to share.
Thank you, Isaac. Alexis.
Yeah, just following up on Don's comment about not having very much interest from the desal companies. I think that's really interesting. And a parallel we've kind of had is with like drinking water. And so, you know, a lot of these drinking water companies are, you know, they're pulling water from some big reservoir, in many cases is impacted by HABs. And sometimes they want to treat it and sometimes they don't want to actually use a HAB control, you know, strategy, and instead are just going to like remove the toxins in their internal system. But typically there'll be a, you know, they'll estimate the cost, like how much is it going to cost for them to actually deal with the origin of the problem, like treat the harmful algal bloom in their water body versus what is it going to cost for me to remove the toxins. And in some cases, there are also like discharge requirements of like the water has to meet a certain criteria for cell counts or for toxins for them to be able to discharge it. You know, in some of these, you know, kind of the water system in California, there'll be water will move from one reservoir to another. And so there will be standards that they'll need. But yeah, for us, like it really just depends if is it cheaper for them to treat the HAB in the in their reservoir, or is it cheaper for them to just deal with it after the water comes in? So yeah, and I guess I would suspect, I mean, with desal, it's tricky because it's an ocean, right? And that's always like it's a lot harder to, you know, treat, you know, open bodies of water versus like, you know, large reservoirs, for example.
Yeah. Thanks, Alexis. I'm going to call on attendee now. John Ramsdell has your hand up.
Hi, John. We have unmuted you, so you should be able to contribute to the conversation. But let me know in the chat if you're having issues. Gotcha.
Right.
Thank you.
All right. Let's move on to Dean, and then if we get John back, we'll get back to John.
This is just, and perhaps you've thought of this, just throwing this out there for the desal question, but we had the same challenge as we had desalination on our vessels, typically 3,000 to 5,000 cubic meters of fresh water we'd need to develop to do fish treatments. But our solution was to actually upwell at deeper depths. So that might not always be the case in the proximity where you are, but we could put an airlift upwelling solution, usually about 40 to 50 meters at depth, where it's free of most phytoplanktons. The thing that we had to be careful of, because we're still using obviously fine micron filters, is then creating aeration intake. So doing it so that you get the uplifting of the deeper, heavier, dense salinity water, and then on the downwelling is where we would draw on the salinity water for doing the desalination. And we were able to do the desal without having to do any back flushing in typically the 3,000 cubes.
Thanks, Dean. Don or John, if you are not able to join verbally and would like to connect with us later, we'd be happy to take that input or your comments, or you can put them in the chat. If not, I will. Oh, we have one. Nia, please.
Okay, thanks. I just wanted to follow up on Greg's comment about targeted outreach. I think part of the outreach process is to be adaptable and listen in on the stakeholders and their needs. And so the more we understand about their needs, whether it be the technology or the costs, you can adjust the treatment technology. But creating that relationship is paramount at first, and that's where everything else go ahead and grows from there. So targeted outreach is extremely important. And sometimes it takes going outside of the box and seeking out those who have these issues instead of waiting for them to seek you out.
Okay. Thank you, Nia. So John's question to everybody, how do the panel members feel about independent testing? Kevin.
I'm guessing he may be, that's kind of the hat that Moat put on for independent third-party testing of different tools and technologies that were available through both the Red Tide Initiative and the U.S. HAB Incubator to put a structure together where you can test it through a structured protocol and produce unbiased results from a third party. So we're highly supportive of that. I think if it's done in-house, there could be a lot of complications of either missteps or perceptions. So trying to follow just that path.
Great, thanks, Kevin. And Heather.
Yes, I'll put on my old Ohio EPA hat now and say that was obviously the gold standard when we were reviewing data, just because, if it's not independent or at minimum peer reviewed, then it's going to be looked at with a lot more scrutiny.
And Alexis.
Yeah, 100%. Like let's let the science speak for itself. And with having like kind of this is kind of that whole discussion of the test beds back again, where it's like, yeah, let's have that third party independent testing. And I mean, that's good for actually improving these water bodies. And it's also really good for, as an industry member, because it'll increase adoption by some of our customers, where they can clearly see, oh, well, this technology did great. Okay, let's use it. So yeah, super supportive of that.
Right. Thanks, Alexis. I'm going to go with Al. Dean had his hand up. We'll go with Al, and then we'll wrap up today's dialogue. So go ahead, Al.
Yeah, we are full favor of third-party testing. One thing, though, is it has to be equitable. We have to make sure that everybody has an opportunity. The different technologies have the same opportunity to test. And with that testing, then be able to be compared. We're confident in our technology, and I'm sure the other industry folks are confident in their technology. But access is most important, So if we're going to do third-party testing, let's make sure that we have an equal chance. That's our feeling. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Al. And I'm going to say thanks to everybody. A fantastic conversation today. Lots of engagement, both through our panel and the online discussion, as well as through the chat function. A lot of great information coming through there. In addition, I'd like to thank all of our support team. This was a lot of people that put these activities together. All the behind the scenes efforts of those who supported through multiple planning meetings, put together the background paper, the case studies, all leading towards this discussion, which was a fantastic discussion, but also the two previous dialogues for those who also participated in those. It's successful because of this work. And so that hard work and dedicated effort has really paid off. So thank you all. And you see many of those people on the screen today. In terms of our next steps, our team will generate a report that summarizes the conversation and takeaways from today's discussion. And you can expect to see that draft report within the next 10 days. Following that report, our team will put together a synthesis of the entire dialogue series, including distilling the recommendations that we received over these past 2 months into actionable next steps. So with that, and on behalf of the Ocean Enterprise staff, volunteers, and partners, I wish you all the best for the remainder of your day or night, and look forward to connecting with you all again soon. And goodbye.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.